The morning mist clung to the valley like a whispered secret, and through it, Sarah lifted another log into place. Her calloused hands gripped the rough bark as she maneuvered the heavy timber, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. 3 months she'd been at this, rising with the sun and working until her muscles screamed for mercy. The cabin was taking shape slowly, one log at a time, just like her new life. From his perch on the ridge above, Jake Whitmore watched her through the scope of his rifle. Though he'd long since given up any pretense of hunting, the deer had grown wise to his presence anyway, sensing that his attention lay elsewhere. He'd been coming to this spot for weeks now, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the stubborn determination in the way she hefted those logs, or the way she paused sometimes to wipe her brow and survey her work with fierce pride. Maybe it was just that he'd grown tired of talking only to his horse and the empty rooms of his ranch house. Sarah Caldwell had arrived in Millbrook Valley in early spring, driving a wagon loaded with supplies and pulling a stubborn mule named Jasper. The townspeople had watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she'd purchased the old Henderson claim, 20 acres of wilderness that had defeated to previous owners. She was a woman alone, maybe 30 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that seemed to see right through a person's pretenses. She'd paid cash for the land and politely declined all offers of help, making it clear she intended to build her homestead with her own two hands. The locals had given her 2 weeks before she'd come crawling back to town, looking for a husband or a way back east. That was for months ago, and Sarah's half-built cabin stood as testament to their miscalculation. Jake had first noticed her on a supply run to town. She'd been loading a wagon with lumber, her movements efficient and purposeful, when old Pete Miller had suggested she might be biting off more than she could chew. She'd fixed him with a look that could have frozen the creek in July and said, "I've chewed through tougher bark than this, Mr. Miller." The men had laughed, but Jake had seen something in her eyes that reminded him of a cornered wildcat, beautiful and dangerous and completely self-reliant. Now, as he watched her notch another log with careful precision, Jake found himself wondering what had driven her to this remote valley. Women didn't usually take on homesteading alone unless they were running from something, or toward something with equal desperation. He knew that feeling intimately. His own ranch, sprawling across the next valley over, had been his refuge after Mary's death 3 years ago. The difference was that he'd inherited his isolation, while Sarah had chosen hers. The sun climbed higher, and Sarah paused to drink from her water bucket. Jake watched her survey her work, her hands on her hips, and he could see the satisfaction in her posture. The cabin walls were nearly waist-high now, each log fitted with the skill of someone who'd done this before. She wasn't just stubborn. He realized she was competent. A movement in the trees behind her caught his attention, and Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. 3 wolves emerged from the timber, their yellow eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory interest. She hadn't seen them yet, her back turned as she selected her next log. Jake was too far away to shout a warning that would reach her in time, but he was an excellent shot. His finger found the trigger just as Sarah turned around. Instead of screaming or running, she slowly reached for the axe beside her and faced the wolves with steady calm. "Easy now," she said, her voice carrying clearly. In the thin air, "I'm not looking for trouble, and I suspect you're not either." The largest wolf, a grizzled alpha with battle scars across his muzzle, padded closer. Sarah didn't flinch. "I've got nothing you want, and you've got no reason to want me." For a long moment, predator and woman regarded each other in perfect stillness. Then the alpha wolf turned and melted back into the trees, his pack following. Sarah waited until they were gone before setting down her axe, and Jake realized he'd been holding his breath. That evening, Jake rode down to her camp. She was sitting by her fire, a tin cup in her hands. When he emerged from the trees on his buckskin mare, she looked up without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. "You're the one who's been watching me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Jake." Dismounted and touched his hat brim. "Jake Whitmore. I've got a ranch over the next ridge." Sarah Caldwell. She gestured to the log beside her fire. "You might as well sit. I've got coffee if you're interested." He accepted the cup she offered and settled beside her, close enough to catch the scent of pine soap and honest sweat. Saw you with those wolves today. That was brave. Or stupid. She sipped her coffee, her eyes reflecting the firelight. I've found the two are often the same thing. You handled it well. Most folks would have panicked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. I've been handling things on my own for a while now. You learn to stay calm when panic isn't a luxury you can afford. Jake studied her profile in the firelight, noting the firm set of her jaw and the way her hands remained steady despite the day's hard work. Mind if I ask what brought you to Millbrook Valley? She turned to look at him directly, and he saw something flicker in her green eyes. Same thing that brings most people to places like this. The need to start over, running from something, toward something. She stood and walked to the edge of her firelight, looking out at the dark forest. I was married once, had a little house in St. Louis with lace curtains and a garden. My husband was a good man, steady and kind. We wanted children. But she paused, her voice growing soft. 5 years we tried. 5 babies I lost before they could draw a breath. Jake felt his chest tighten. He knew the particular pain of losing what you'd never quite had. The way hope could become its own kind of torture. Thomas, my husband, he tried to comfort me, said we'd keep trying, that God would bless us in his time. But I could see the disappointment in his eyes, the way he'd look at other men's children with such longing. I started to feel like I was failing him just by being alive. She turned back to face him, her expression fierce. So I left, took my share of our savings, and came west to build something that couldn't die on me. The fire popped and crackled between them, filling the silence with its ancient music. Jake understood now why she'd chosen this hard path, why she'd rather break her back building a cabin than break her heart trying to build a family. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Sarah studied his face in the firelight. What about you, Jake Whitmore? What brings a man to watch a woman build a cabin instead of building his own life? Jake felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that had lived there since Mary's funeral. I had a wife too, Mary. She died 3 years ago in childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. I'm sorry, Sarah echoed his words, but there was understanding in her voice that made them mean something different. I've got a big house, good land, everything a man's supposed to want. But it's just me rattling around in all that space. And some days the silence is so loud I can't think straight. He looked at her half-built cabin, at the evidence of her determination and skill. I guess I've been watching you, because you're building something instead of just maintaining. What's left? They sat in comfortable silence for a while. To people who'd learned that dreams could die and leave you with nothing but the choice to keep living or give up entirely. Finally, Sarah spoke. I could use some help with the roof beams. They're too heavy for me to manage alone. Jake looked at her, surprised. I thought you were determined to do this yourself. I am. But there's a difference between being independent and being foolish. I can't build a proper roof without help, and winter's coming. She met his eyes. Besides, I make good coffee, and I suspect you could use the company as much as I could use the help. The next morning, Jake arrived at Sarah's camp before sunrise, his pack horse loaded with tools and supplies. She was already up, splitting kindling with practiced efficiency. She looked up as he approached and nodded toward the cabin. I've been thinking about the roof pitch, she said without preamble. The snow load here is heavy, so we'll need a steep angle, and I want a good overhang to keep the rain off the walls. Jake dismounted and walked over to examine her work. The cabin walls were solid and straight, each log carefully fitted and chinked. You've done good work here. Who taught you to build like this? My father. He was a carpenter back in Ohio before he died. I used to help him when I was young, before my mother decided it wasn't proper for a girl. Sarah picked up her axe and tested its edge. I've been remembering his lessons as I go. They worked together through the morning, measuring and cutting, fitting the heavy roof beams into place. Jake found himself impressed by Sarah's skill and knowledge. She wasn't just stubborn determination in skirts. She was a craftsman in her own right. When they paused for lunch, he voiced his admiration. You know what you're doing. This cabin's going to be solid as a rock. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It better be. I plan to grow old in it. As the days passed, Jake found himself looking forward to the work at Sarah's cabin. More than anything he'd experienced in years, she was easy to work with, competent and decisive, and she had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard.